You seem tired. 3 ordinary words from a little girl should have disappeared the moment the elevator doors opened. Instead, they followed Ethan Carter like an echo that refused to fade. At exactly 7:42 on a cool October morning, Ethan stepped out of his black SUV in front of Carter Dynamics headquarters in downtown Chicago. The 40-story tower reflected the pale sunrise like polished steel, every sheet of glass reminding the city that success had an address. Employees hurried through the revolving doors carrying coffee cups, laptop bags, and unfinished conversations. But whenever they noticed Ethan approaching, voices softened, smiles became professional, and everyone instinctively stepped aside. That was how every morning began. Predictable, precise, untouchable. Ethan preferred it that way. His calendar had already been scheduled down to the minute. Quarterly budget review, investor briefing, product launch rehearsal, charity luncheon that his assistant had accepted on his behalf, dinner with board members he barely considered friends. His watch buzzed softly, reminding him he was already 30 seconds behind schedule. He entered the marble lobby without looking up. The security guards greeted him by name. He acknowledged them with the same polite nod he had perfected years ago, warm enough to seem respectful, distant enough to end every conversation before it could begin. His private elevator waited behind frosted glass, reserved exclusively for executive leadership. It always did, except this morning. A maintenance sign blocked the entrance. His assistant's voice crackled through his wireless earbud. "They're servicing the executive lift, Mr. Carter. Just take elevator B. It'll bring you to the same floor." Ethan frowned. He hated changes, especially unnecessary ones. Still, an elevator was an elevator. He pressed the call button, glanced at another email, and stepped inside the moment the doors slid open. Only after the doors closed did he realize he had entered the service elevator instead of the employee one. It smelled faintly of fresh paint and lemon cleaner rather than expensive cologne. The polished walls gave way to brushed metal scratched by years of carts and equipment. A small folding cart sat near the corner beside a cardboard box decorated with hand-drawn stars in blue marker. Standing next to it was a little girl, maybe 8 years old, with neatly brushed blonde hair tied back by a pale blue ribbon that had clearly been worn many times before. She wore clean sneakers, faded jeans, and an oversized cream-colored sweater whose sleeves reached almost to her fingertips. Balanced carefully in both hands was a small white bakery box wrapped with twine. She looked up without surprise, as though powerful men accidentally riding service elevators happened every day. Ethan returned his attention to his phone. Market numbers. International emails. Another meeting request. None of it held his focus for long. He sensed the child quietly studying him with the honest curiosity only children seem to possess. The elevator climbed in complete silence until it reached the 12th floor. Just before the doors opened, the little girl smiled, not the nervous smile adults used in offices, but one that carried no expectation at all, and said softly, "You seem tired." That was it. 3 simple words. No request, no compliment, no attempt to impress him. She stepped out, carrying the little bakery box into the hallway, disappearing among supply carts and bright fluorescent lights before Ethan could think of a response. The doors closed again. The elevator continued upward. Yet for reasons he couldn't explain, the silence she left behind felt louder than every board meeting waiting for him upstairs. Ethan stepped out onto the executive floor, but the rhythm that had governed his life for nearly 2 decades no longer felt perfectly synchronized. The hallway buzzed with quiet efficiency as assistants crossed polished floors carrying folders. Conference room screens flickered awake with financial projections, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the reception area. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Only Ethan felt different, although he could not explain why. His assistant, Rebecca Collins, met him outside the boardroom with a tablet already displaying his schedule. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." The investors from Seattle arrived early. Marketing has requested 5 additional minutes before the presentation, and legal needs your signature before noon. Ethan accepted the tablet without answering immediately. His eyes drifted toward the elevator doors at the far end of the hallway. They opened and closed as employees stepped in and out, each person carrying another ordinary morning into the building. The little girl was nowhere to be seen. "Mr. Carter?" Rebecca asked gently. He blinked. "Yes. Let us begin." The boardroom overlooked Lake Michigan through floor-to-ceiling windows that made the city appear almost weightless beneath the autumn sky. 12 executives sat around the long walnut table, each prepared with charts, forecasts, and carefully rehearsed remarks. Normally, Ethan would have guided the meeting with flawless precision, interrupting when necessary, correcting mistakes before they formed, and moving every discussion toward measurable results. Today, his attention wandered. As the chief financial officer explained projected earnings for the next quarter, Ethan found himself remembering a pair of bright blue eyes that had looked at him without fear, admiration, or expectation. They had simply noticed him. "You seem tired." 3 words. Nothing more. He had received awards from governors, praise from international business magazines, and standing ovations from thousands of employees at company events. None of those moments lingered in his mind the way those 3 words did. Rebecca quietly slid another document in front of him. Ethan signed it automatically before realizing he had not read a single line. That almost never happened. He set the pen down and looked around the room. Faces spoke confidently about expansion, acquisitions, productivity, and shareholder value. Every sentence was polished. Every graph climbed upward. Yet something inside him felt strangely hollow, as though he had spent years building taller walls without noticing how empty the rooms behind them had become. During a short break, Ethan walked alone toward the windows overlooking the city below. Cars flowed through morning traffic like tiny streams of light. Somewhere inside the massive building beneath him, that little girl was probably sitting quietly beside her mother, waiting for the school day to end. She had carried a small bakery box tied with simple twine as though it contained something precious. He wondered who it was for. A birthday, a thank you, maybe just breakfast. The thought surprised him. He realized he knew almost nothing about the thousands of people who worked inside his own company beyond job titles and employee numbers. For years, he had believed leadership meant always staying several steps ahead. Standing there in the silence, he began to wonder if real leadership sometimes required slowing down long enough to actually see the people walking beside you. By late afternoon, the meetings had finally ended, but instead of heading straight to the private parking garage as he always did, Ethan found himself walking without any clear destination. Rebecca noticed immediately. "Your car is waiting downstairs," she reminded him. Ethan slipped his phone into his coat pocket. "I think I will take a walk through the building first." Rebecca looked surprised, but simply nodded. Few people questioned Ethan Carter once he had made a decision. He rode a different elevator this time, watching employees step on and off at various floors. The executive offices gave way to engineering departments, then customer support, then facilities management. It was a side of the company he had not visited in years. The polished marble gradually became practical tile flooring, and expensive artwork gave way to bulletin boards covered with family photographs, birthday announcements, and handwritten thank you notes. The atmosphere felt lighter somehow. People laughed more here. They spoke to one another instead of only sending emails. Ethan slowed his pace as he reached a quiet corridor near the maintenance offices. A familiar laugh drifted through the hallway. Soft, bright, impossible to mistake. He followed the sound until he reached a small employee break room with the door standing halfway open. Sitting at a round table was the little girl from the elevator. The white bakery box rested beside her, now open to reveal. Several homemade cinnamon rolls arranged neatly on wax paper. Across from her sat a woman in a navy custodial uniform, her blonde hair pulled into a simple ponytail as she enjoyed a quick break between shifts. The little girl noticed Ethan first. Her face brightened with quiet recognition rather than excitement. "Hi," she said with an easy smile. "You found the right elevator this time." Ethan laughed softly before he realized he was laughing at all. "I suppose I did." The woman immediately stood. "I am sorry, sir. I hope Grace has not been bothering anyone. School is closed today because of teacher conferences, so she stays with me until my shift ends." Ethan gently shook his head. "Not at all." Grace looked up at her mother. "Mom, this is the tired man." Her mother looked embarrassed. "Grace, it is all right," Ethan replied, smiling more naturally than he had in a long time. She was very observant this morning. Grace reached into the bakery box and carefully lifted one cinnamon roll wrapped in a napkin. "Would you like one?" she asked. "Mom says sharing makes food taste better." Ethan hesitated. No one had offered him homemade food in years. Business dinners came with crystal glasses and expensive menus, but this simple pastry somehow felt more valuable. He accepted it with both hands. Thank you. Grace swung her feet gently beneath the chair. I told Mom you looked like somebody who forgets to eat breakfast. Ethan glanced down at the warm cinnamon roll before looking back at the little girl. Is that another observation? Grace nodded. People who are always thinking forget little things. Breakfast. Sunshine. Smiling. They remember important meetings, but sometimes they forget important moments. Ethan stood perfectly still. Once again, the words came without judgment, without trying to impress. She simply spoke as though she were describing the weather outside. And somehow, standing in a small employee break room with a cinnamon roll warming his hands, Ethan felt as though he had stumbled into a conversation he had needed for years without ever realizing he had been searching for it. Grace's mother smiled apologetically as she checked the time on the old wristwatch she wore every day. I should get back to work before my supervisor starts wondering where I disappeared to, she said, gently brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Grace knows to stay right here until I finish this floor. Ethan nodded. Of course. The woman excused herself with another polite smile before pushing her custodial cart back into the hallway. Within seconds, only Ethan and Grace remained in the quiet break room. The little girl carefully folded the empty wax paper from the cinnamon rolls and placed it back inside the bakery box, as though even small things deserved respect. Ethan leaned lightly against the counter, still holding the untouched pastry in his hand. Can I ask you something? Grace looked up. Sure. This morning, in the elevator. Why did you say I seemed tired? She tilted her head for a moment, thinking carefully before answering. Because you did. Ethan smiled faintly. Most people would have said I looked busy. Grace shrugged. Busy is what people are doing. Tired is what people are feeling. Her answer landed quietly, but it settled somewhere much deeper than Ethan expected. How could you tell? He asked. Grace rested both elbows on the table and folded her hands together. My mom says eyes tell the truth before mouths do. She pointed gently toward his face without sounding rude. Your mouth smiled at people this morning. Your eyes never did. Ethan instinctively looked toward the dark reflection in the microwave door across the room, seeing his own face from a distance. For years he had practiced the perfect executive smile, confident enough for shareholders, reassuring enough for employees, composed enough for interviews. He had never once wondered whether his eyes had agreed with it. Grace continued in the same calm voice. When I was little, I used to draw smiley faces on everything because I thought smiling made people happy. Then Mom told me real smiles start inside first. Ethan remained silent. The room felt strangely peaceful, interrupted only by the distant hum of vacuum cleaners somewhere down the hallway. Do you know something funny? Grace asked. What? Adults hide all the time. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Hide? She nodded seriously. Not behind trees. Behind schedules. Behind phones. Behind work. Behind pretending everything is okay. She smiled again, not because she thought she had said something clever, but because to her it was simply true. Kids do it sometimes too, but adults get really good at it. Ethan lowered his eyes to the cinnamon roll still warming his hands. He suddenly realized he had spent years hiding behind conference rooms, earnings reports, and endless responsibilities because those things were easier to manage than loneliness. No investor had ever noticed. No journalist had ever asked. Yet an 8-year-old girl had seen through everything in less than 30 seconds inside an elevator. Grace slid a colorful sheet of paper across the table. It was a drawing done with crayons. In the center stood a tall office building stretching into bright blue skies. Tiny people smiled outside its front doors, while sunlight filled every window. I drew this while Mom was working, she said proudly. Ethan studied the picture. Where am I? Grace pointed to a tiny figure near the entrance instead of the corner office at the top. Right there. Ethan looked surprised. Not upstairs. Grace shook her head with complete certainty. Buildings are important because of the people who walk into them, not because of the people who sit above them. For the third time that day, Ethan found himself unable to answer, because every word she spoke quietly dismantled a belief he had spent years building. When Ethan finally left the break room, the cinnamon roll was gone, but its warmth seemed to linger long after the last bite. It had been years since something so simple had tasted so genuine. The hallway looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier, yet every face passing by suddenly seemed less like part of a corporation and more like part of a story he had never taken the time to read. On his way back toward the executive offices, he noticed the security guard holding the front entrance open for a delivery driver balancing several heavy boxes. Normally, Ethan would have walked past without slowing down. This time he stopped. "Good afternoon, Marcus," he said after reading the guard's name badge. The older man blinked in surprise before smiling. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter." Ethan realized he had seen Marcus almost every workday for 6 years, yet this was the first time he had spoken his name aloud. As he continued through the lobby, he greeted the receptionist, thanked a maintenance technician repairing a ceiling light, and even paused to compliment the fresh flowers arranged near the reception desk. None of the interactions lasted more than a few seconds, but each one felt strangely significant. Employees looked at one another with puzzled expressions after he passed, quietly wondering what had changed. Upstairs, Rebecca was waiting outside his office with another stack of reports. She followed him inside as he removed his coat. "You seem different today," she said carefully. Ethan smiled, and for the first time she noticed the expression reached his eyes. "Do I?" She nodded. "Usually you walk straight to your desk before asking about anything else. Today you stopped to talk with half the building." Ethan glanced through the office windows overlooking Chicago. "Perhaps I should have started doing that years ago." Rebecca hesitated before placing another folder in front of him. The cafeteria manager also sent an invitation. "Tomorrow they are introducing a new employee lunch program. They assumed you would decline, so they only sent it as a courtesy." Ethan opened the folder without really reading it. "Tell them I will be there." Rebecca stared at him for a moment. "In the employee cafeteria?" "Yes." "Not the executive dining room?" "No." She smiled, almost amused. "They're going to think someone replaced you overnight." Ethan laughed quietly. Maybe someone did. Later that afternoon, he passed another hallway where Grace sat reading a library book while waiting for her mother to finish the final floor. She waved enthusiastically when she spotted him. "Did you remember to smile with your eyes?" she asked. Ethan paused, then smiled again, making no effort to practice or perfect it. Grace studied him for a second before giving an approving nod. "Better." He walked away feeling unexpectedly lighter. That evening, instead of remaining in his office until after dark as he had done almost every weekday for years, Ethan closed his laptop while the sun was still shining over the city. As he rode the elevator down through the building, he noticed people talking together, sharing coffee, laughing at stories from their day. He wondered how many moments like these he had missed while chasing meetings that no one would remember a year later. His phone vibrated with another message reminding him about tomorrow's schedule, but before locking the screen, he added something that had never appeared on any of his calendars before. In the empty space between two meetings, he typed 6 simple words. Visit Grace and her mother again. For the first time in many years, he was looking forward to tomorrow for reasons that had nothing to do with business. The next morning arrived with crisp air rolling across the Chicago skyline, painting the windows of Carter Dynamics with soft golden light. Ethan reached the office earlier than usual, but instead of going directly to the executive floor, he stopped at the small cafe across the street. The display case was filled with pastries, fresh muffins, and cinnamon rolls that looked almost identical to the one Grace had shared the day before. He smiled quietly to himself and ordered 2 warm cinnamon rolls along with a carton of fresh milk. When he entered the building, Marcus greeted him with a cheerful smile that no longer felt formal. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." Ethan nodded warmly. "Good morning, Marcus." As he walked through the lobby, he noticed Grace sitting in her familiar chair outside the employee break room. She was completely focused on a large sketchbook balanced across her knees, her tongue peeking slightly from the corner of her mouth in deep concentration. She did not even notice him until his shadow crossed the page. Looking up, her face lit with genuine delight. "You came back." Ethan lifted the bakery bag. "I remembered breakfast today." Grace laughed softly. "See? You are already improving." They settled at the same small round table while Grace's mother finished preparing her cleaning supplies. Before beginning another shift, Ethan placed the warm pastries between them. "I thought it might be my turn to share." Grace smiled. "Mom says kindness grows faster when people take turns." As they ate together, Ethan noticed several detailed drawings filling Grace's sketchbook. None looked like ordinary children's doodles. They were surprisingly careful, with straight lines, windows, rooftops, parks, and entire neighborhoods connected by tree-lined sidewalks. One drawing showed a beautiful library surrounded by flowers. Another imagined a school with a rooftop garden. Ethan slowly turned another page and found an elegant drawing of a skyscraper unlike anything he had ever seen. Sunlight poured through enormous windows while people gathered on open terraces filled with plants instead of gray concrete. "Did you draw all of these?" he asked. Grace nodded proudly. "I want to design buildings someday." Ethan studied the pages again. "You mean you want to become an architect?" "Yes." Her answer came without hesitation. Buildings should help people feel welcome before they even walk inside. Ethan looked around the simple employee break room. "That is a beautiful way to think about it." Grace smiled, but then her expression softened. "Mom says dreams are free, so I can draw as many as I want." Ethan sensed something behind the words. "What does your mother think?" Grace carefully closed the sketchbook. "She says if I study hard, maybe one day I can go to college." She paused before adding quietly, "It might take a long time because college costs a lot of money." Ethan remained silent. Grace never sounded discouraged. She simply accepted each obstacle with the same quiet honesty that made everything she said feel important. Her mother stepped into the room carrying fresh cleaning cloths and offered an apologetic smile. "I hope she has not been talking your ears off again." Ethan shook his head. "Actually, she has been teaching me." Grace giggled while hugging her sketchbook against her chest. Ethan looked at the colorful drawings once more and found himself imagining those buildings standing across American cities one day. For the first time, he realized that extraordinary dreams sometimes begin on ordinary pieces of paper held together by a child who simply refuses to stop believing. The afternoon that followed began with optimism, but it did not stay that way for long. Ethan returned to the executive floor carrying Grace's sketchbook in his thoughts, still picturing the sunlight she had drawn pouring through buildings designed to welcome people instead of impress them. As he stepped into the boardroom, the atmosphere felt noticeably heavier than usual. Thick presentation binders waited at every seat, and a single phrase displayed across the large screen immediately caught his attention. Operational Cost Reduction Initiative. Rebecca quietly placed the final report beside him before taking her seat near the wall. The chief financial officer stood and began outlining the proposal with calm confidence. "After 6 months of analysis, we recommend outsourcing all facility maintenance and custodial operations beginning January 1st. Independent contractors will reduce annual operating costs by approximately $4.3 million. Several board members nodded approvingly. Charts filled the screen, each one climbing neatly upward. Savings, efficiency, profit margins. The numbers were impressive. Ethan listened in silence until another slide appeared showing every department affected by the proposal. More than 80 employees, janitors, maintenance technicians, evening cleaning crews, people whose names he had only recently begun learning. The presenter continued speaking. "The transition will be smooth. Existing employees will receive standard separation packages according to company policy." Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the list. Somewhere among those names was Grace's mother, a woman who worked quietly every day while her daughter waited patiently with a sketchbook and dreams bigger than the city outside those windows. He slowly opened the folder in front of him and discovered something that made his stomach tighten. His own electronic approval had already been attached weeks earlier as part of a routine authorization included among dozens of operational documents he had signed without reading. Carefully, Rebecca noticed the change in his expression. She leaned closer and whispered softly. It was included with the quarterly efficiency package before the final review. Ethan closed the folder without saying a word. Suddenly, he remembered Grace's gentle voice. Adults hide behind schedules, behind work. For years, he had trusted numbers more quickly than faces. He had approved decisions measured in spreadsheets without considering the lives quietly standing behind every statistic. The meeting continued as executives discussed implementation dates and projected investor reactions, but Ethan heard very little. His thoughts drifted back to the little break room where Grace proudly described the buildings she hoped to design one day. College might already seem impossible to her family. Losing her mother's job would make that dream even more distant. The board chair finally turned toward him. "Mr. Carter, since this initiative already carries your preliminary authorization, we are prepared to schedule the public announcement next week. Do you have any additional comments?" Every eye in the room shifted toward Ethan. Outside the windows, the afternoon sun reflected across the Chicago skyline, just as it had every other day. But inside him something had changed forever. He thought about Marcus greeting people by name every morning. He thought about the receptionist arranging fresh flowers before sunrise. He thought about the maintenance technician repairing lights that no one else noticed. Most of all, he thought about a little girl who believed buildings existed to make people feel welcome. Ethan folded his hands together and looked slowly around the table. For the first time in years, the decision before him was no longer about numbers. It was about people. And he knew that whatever happened next would reveal not only what kind of company Carter Dynamics wanted to become, but what kind of man he had finally decided to be. Silence settled over the boardroom after the chairman finished speaking. No one reached for a pen. No one looked away from Ethan. For several long seconds, he simply remained seated, his hands resting calmly on the polished walnut table as the city shimmered beyond the glass. Then he slowly closed the proposal folder and slid it to the center of the table. "We are not moving forward with this plan," he said quietly. A few executives exchanged confused glances. The chief financial officer leaned forward. "Mr. Carter, eliminating these positions is projected to save more than $4 million annually." Ethan nodded. "I read the numbers." "Then you understand the financial benefit." Ethan looked around the room before answering. "I finally understand something more important than the financial benefit." The room fell silent again. He stood and walked toward the windows overlooking Chicago, speaking with a calm confidence that carried far more weight than anger ever could. "For years we have measured success by quarterly reports, market growth, and shareholder returns. Those things matter. They always will. But somewhere along the way, we forgot to measure whether the people who built this company could still believe it cared about them." He turned back toward the table. "Every employee who unlocks these doors before sunrise, every person who cleans our offices after everyone else goes home, every maintenance worker who keeps this building running deserves more than being reduced to a line on a spreadsheet." One board member cleared his throat. "Investors may question this decision." Ethan smiled gently. "Then I will answer their questions myself." He returned to his chair and opened a fresh notebook. "Instead of eliminating these positions, I want a different proposal. We will modernize equipment, expand training opportunities, and create advancement paths for facilities employees who want to grow within the company. If we expect people to invest their lives in Carter Dynamics, then we should invest in theirs." Rebecca looked up from her notes, unable to hide her smile. The meeting ended without another vote. Within hours, the revised announcement began moving through every department. No layoffs, no outsourcing, new education assistance programs, expanded employee development. The news spread faster than anyone expected. Downstairs, Grace sat coloring another building in her sketchbook when her mother walked into the break room holding a printed memo with tears quietly gathering in her eyes. "Mom," Grace asked softly. Her mother knelt beside her and wrapped both arms around her. "I still have my job." Grace blinked. "Really?" Her mother nodded, smiling through happy tears. "Not only that, they are starting a scholarship program for employees and their children." Grace looked down at her sketchbook before looking back toward the hallway just as Ethan appeared in the doorway. He carried no speech, no cameras, and no reporters. Only a small cardboard tube tied with a blue ribbon. "I thought you might like this," he said, handing it to Grace. She carefully untied the ribbon and slowly unrolled the large sheet inside. It was professional architectural drawing paper, bright white and perfectly smooth. Her eyes grew wide with wonder. "Real blueprint paper?" Ethan nodded. "For future buildings that help people feel welcome." Grace hugged the roll against her chest as though it were the greatest treasure she had ever received. Then she reached into her backpack and removed one last homemade cinnamon roll wrapped neatly in wax paper. She placed it gently into Ethan's hands with the same quiet kindness she had shown from the beginning. She studied his face for a moment, smiled with complete certainty, and said, "You do not look tired anymore." Ethan smiled back, and this time his eyes smiled first. 1 year later, the first cool breeze of autumn drifted through downtown Chicago, carrying the familiar scent of roasted coffee and turning leaves. Carter Dynamics looked much the same from the outside, its glass tower still reaching confidently into the skyline. But inside, something had quietly transformed. Employees greeted one another by name. The executive dining room had become a shared gathering space a few days each month. Scholarship recipients' artwork and achievements lined the lobby walls beside company awards, reminding every visitor that success could be measured in more than revenue. Ethan Carter no longer hurried through the building with his eyes fixed on a screen. He knew Marcus always arrived 20 minutes early because he liked watching the sunrise from the front entrance. He knew the receptionist's daughter had just started college. He knew the maintenance crew preferred working before dawn because they took pride in making every office feel ready before the first employee arrived. The building had not become more efficient simply because new systems had been installed. It had become warmer because people felt seen. That afternoon, Ethan intentionally stepped into the service elevator instead of the executive one. It had quietly become his favorite route through the building. As the doors closed, he smiled to himself, remembering the morning when a simple mistake had unexpectedly become the most important appointment of his life. The elevator stopped on the 12th floor. The doors opened, and there stood Grace, now a little taller than before, carrying a large portfolio case instead of the small sketchbook she once hugged so carefully. Her blue ribbon had been replaced by a neat ponytail, but the bright curiosity in her eyes had not changed at all. She stepped inside with an excited smile. "Guess what?" she asked. Ethan laughed softly. "I have a feeling you are going to tell me anyway." She carefully opened the portfolio and revealed several beautifully detailed architectural drawings. One showed a children's library filled with natural light. Another featured a community center surrounded by gardens and shaded walking paths. In the corner of every drawing appeared the same handwritten sentence: "Buildings should make people feel welcome." Ethan recognized the words immediately. "These are remarkable," he said honestly. Grace beamed with quiet pride. "My teacher says I should enter the city design competition this year." "I think your teacher is right." The elevator continued climbing until it reached the executive floor. Before the doors opened, Ethan looked at Grace with a smile that no longer required practice. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded. "Do I still seem tired?" Grace studied him the same thoughtful way she had on that first morning. She looked into his eyes for a long moment before shaking her head with complete certainty. "No," she said softly. "You look like somebody who remembers. Breakfast, sunshine, smiling, and people." The elevator door slid open, but neither of them hurried to leave. Ethan realized that the greatest change had never been the new scholarship program, the revised company policies, or even the culture that now filled the building with kindness. The greatest change had happened quietly inside one human heart. Sometimes people spend their entire lives searching for extraordinary moments, believing they arrive with applause, headlines, or great achievements. Yet every once in a while, an ordinary elevator, an unexpected conversation, and 3 honest words from a child become the beginning of everything that truly matters. And every morning after that, whenever Ethan stepped into any elevator, he remembered that the right direction in life is not always the one that takes you to the highest floor. Sometimes it is simply the one that helps you become the person you were always meant to be.